Good morning, everyone. Life is full of uncertainties, challenges, and moments when we feel like we have lost control. We plan, we hope, and we strive, but sometimes things don't go the way we expect. In those moments, frustration and doubt can take over. But I want to remind you today, leave it in God's hands. Trust His plan. God's wisdom far exceeds our understanding. What seems like a setback may be a setup for something greater. What appears to be a loss may be leading to an even bigger victory. His ways are higher than ours, and His timing is always perfect. Life often presents us with situations that leave us confused, frustrated, and questioning why certain things happen the way they do. We make plans, set goals, and have dreams, yet sometimes things take unexpected turns. Doors close, opportunities slip away, relationships break, and circumstances seem unfair. In these moments, it is easy to wonder, why is this happening? Where is God in all of this? But the truth is, God's wisdom far exceeds our own. He sees the entire picture while we only see a small part. Imagine trying to put together a giant puzzle with only a handful of pieces. You might think one piece belongs in a certain spot, but when you try to fit it in, it just doesn't work. You don't have the full image in front of you, so you can't see how each piece connects. In the same way, we often try to force things to happen in our lives, assuming we know what's best. But God, the creator of all things, already knows exactly where each piece belongs. The Bible tells us in Isaiah 55:8-9, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." This verse reminds us that God's perspective is beyond what we can grasp. While we may struggle to understand why things are happening a certain way, He is always working behind the scenes with a greater purpose in mind. Consider a child who wants to eat candy for breakfast. The child doesn't understand why their parent says no. All they see is something sweet and enjoyable in front of them. But the parent, knowing what is best for their child's health, withholds the candy and provides a nutritious meal instead. In that moment, the child may feel disappointed, even upset, but the parent's wisdom surpasses the child's limited understanding. Similarly, God sometimes withholds things from us, not because He wants to deny us happiness, but because He knows what is truly best for us. Look at the story of Job in the Bible. He was a righteous man who feared God, yet he lost everything, his family, his wealth, and his health. He didn't understand why he was suffering, and even his friends doubted him. But through his trials, Job remained faithful, and in the end, God restored everything to him, even greater than before. If Job had relied on his own understanding, he might have given up, but he trusted in God's wisdom, even when things didn't make sense. We must learn to do the same. Instead of questioning God's plan when things don't go our way, we should remind ourselves that His wisdom is perfect. What we see as a delay may actually be God's divine protection. What we perceive as a failure may be a setup for something greater. God knows what is best for us, and He will never lead us down a path that does not have a purpose. Even when we can't see the full picture, we must trust that God is weaving together every detail of our lives for our good. His wisdom surpasses our understanding, and if we choose to leave everything in His hands, we can walk in faith, knowing that He is guiding us towards something far greater than we could ever imagine. One of the greatest struggles we face as human beings is our desire to understand everything. We want answers. We want to know why certain things happen, why doors close, why relationships don't work out, why we experience pain, and why our prayers sometimes seem unanswered. When things don't make sense, we start relying on our own logic, trying to piece things together in a way that fits our understanding. But the Bible teaches us something very different. In Proverbs 3:5-6, we are reminded, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight." This scripture is powerful because it directly tells us not to rely on our limited human reasoning. Instead, we are called to trust God fully, even when we don't understand what He's doing. Think about a GPS system. When you type in a destination, you follow the directions it gives, even if you don't know the entire route. You trust that it knows the way, and if it says to turn left, you turn left, even if you don't immediately see why. Now imagine if you ignored the GPS and went your own way just because you thought you knew a shortcut. You might end up lost, delayed, or even stuck in a place you didn't intend to go. That's what happens when we rely on our own understanding instead of trusting in God. He sees the entire journey while we only see a small portion. Sometimes trusting God means walking by faith, even when it feels like you are walking in the dark. You may not see the full picture, but that doesn't mean God isn't leading you in the right direction. Take the story of Abraham as an example. When God told him to leave his home and go to a land that He would show him, Abraham didn't have a detailed roadmap. God didn't give him a step-by-step plan. Yet Abraham obeyed and trusted that God would guide him. Because of his faith, God blessed him abundantly and made him the father of many nations. Imagine if Abraham had refused to move until he had all the details. He might have missed out on the incredible promises God had for him. The same principle applies to our lives. There will be times when God asks us to step out in faith without knowing what's ahead. He may ask us to let go of a job, a relationship, or a situation we are comfortable with, even when it doesn't make sense to us. If we rely only on our own understanding, we might resist His guidance, missing out on the greater blessings He has planned. Trusting God over our own understanding also means surrendering control. Many times we try to take matters into our own hands, thinking we know best. But the truth is, when we try to control everything, we only end up feeling more stressed, anxious, and overwhelmed. True peace comes when we let go and allow God to take control. Another powerful example of trusting God rather than human understanding is found in the story of Peter walking on water. When Jesus called Peter to step out of the boat and walk toward Him, Peter did something extraordinary. He walked on water. But as soon as Peter started focusing on the waves and trying to understand the situation with his natural mind, he became afraid and started to sink. Jesus immediately reached out to save him and said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Matthew 14:31. This story teaches us that when we trust in God, the impossible becomes possible. But when we lean on our own understanding, fear and doubt take over. In life, we will face many moments when things don't go as planned. We may not understand why certain things happen, but we must remember that God's ways are higher than our ways. Instead of stressing over what we cannot control or understand, we should place our full trust in Him. The more we trust in God, the more peace we will experience. We may not have all the answers, but we can be confident that God does. One of the hardest things to accept in life is waiting. We live in a fast-paced world where we want things instantly. Instant success, instant healing, instant answers to our prayers. When things don't happen as quickly as we expect, we start to question God. Why is this taking so long? Why haven't my prayers been answered yet? Did God forget about me? But what we must remember is that God's timing is always perfect, never too early, never too late. The Bible tells us in Ecclesiastes 3:11, He has made everything beautiful in its time. This verse reminds us that God works according to His divine timeline, not ours. What may seem like a delay to us is actually God's strategic plan unfolding at the right moment. He sees the full picture. He knows what we need and when we need it. A great example of this is the story of Lazarus in John 11. When Lazarus was sick, his sisters Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus asking Him to come and heal their brother. But instead of rushing to their side immediately, Jesus waited 2 more days before going. By the time He arrived, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. Mary and Martha were devastated and questioned Jesus, saying, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." John 11:21. In their eyes, Jesus was late, but in reality, He was right on time. Instead of simply healing Lazarus from sickness, He performed an even greater miracle. He raised him from the dead. What seemed like a delay was actually part of God's bigger plan to demonstrate His power and increase their faith. This teaches us a crucial lesson. Just because God hasn't moved yet doesn't mean he won't. His delay is not his denial. He is working behind the scenes in ways we cannot see. Sometimes the reason for the wait is that God is preparing us for the blessing He has in store. If we receive something too soon, we may not be ready for it. Just like a fruit that must ripen before it is harvested, some of God's promises require time before they can be fulfilled. Think about Joseph's story. God gave Joseph dreams of greatness when he was just a teenager, showing him that he would one day be in a position of authority. But instead of stepping into that promise immediately, Joseph went through years of hardship, being sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned. From a human perspective, it may have seemed like God had forgotten him, but in reality, God was using those years to prepare Joseph for the role he was destined to fulfill. At the right time, Joseph was elevated to a position of power, becoming second in command in Egypt and saving an entire nation from famine. If Joseph had been promoted too soon, he wouldn't have been ready for the responsibility. God's timing was perfect. Many times we try to rush the process, we force things to happen on our own, only to end up frustrated and exhausted. But when we trust God's timing, we experience peace. Isaiah 40:31 says, "But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Waiting on God is not wasted time. It is preparation time. He strengthens us, builds our character, and aligns everything for His perfect will. Think of a baby growing in the womb. A pregnancy lasts 9 months because that is the time needed for the baby to fully develop. If the baby is born too early, complications arise. The same applies to God's blessings in our lives. If we receive them too soon, we may not be able to handle them properly. God is not just interested in giving us what we want, He is interested in making sure we are ready to receive it. If you are in a season of waiting right now, take heart. God has not forgotten you. The delay you are experiencing may be the very thing that is setting you up for something greater. Trust that His timing is always perfect, and when the time is right, nothing can stop His plan from unfolding in your life. The story of Joseph in the Bible is one of the greatest examples of patience, trust, and God's perfect plan unfolding in His own timing. Joseph's life was filled with trials, betrayals, and hardships, yet in the end, God used everything he went through to fulfill a greater purpose. His story reminds us that even when life seems unfair and we don't understand why we're going through difficulties, God is working behind the scenes to bring something good out of it. Joseph was just 17 years old when God gave him dreams that showed he would one day be in a position of authority. In these dreams, his brothers bowed before him, and even the sun, moon, and stars symbolically recognized his leadership. Joseph, in his youthful enthusiasm, shared these dreams with his family, but instead of celebrating with him, his brothers were filled with jealousy and resentment. They couldn't imagine that their younger brother, whom they looked down on, could ever rule over them. Out of their hatred, Joseph's brothers plotted against him. At first, they wanted to kill him, but instead they decided to sell him into slavery. Joseph was taken to Egypt, far from his home and family, where he was sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. Imagine how Joseph must have felt, betrayed by his own brothers, torn away from everything he knew, and forced into a life of servitude. He could have lost hope, he could have given up, but he chose to trust God instead. Even in slavery, Joseph remained faithful. He worked diligently in Potiphar's house, and because of his integrity and God's favor upon him, he was promoted to a position of responsibility. Just when things seemed to be improving, however, another trial came. Potiphar's wife falsely accused him of a crime he didn't commit, and he was thrown into prison. At this point, many people would have questioned God. Why is this happening to me? I've done nothing wrong. If you gave me a dream, why am I suffering? Yet Joseph did not complain. He continued to trust God even in prison. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, he remained faithful. And once again, God's favor was upon him. He was put in charge of the other prisoners, and while in prison, he interpreted dreams for 2 of Pharaoh's officials. One of these men, Pharaoh's cupbearer, was later restored to his position, and Joseph asked him to remember him and help him get out of prison. But what happened? The cupbearer forgot about Joseph for 2 whole years. Can you imagine how discouraging that must have been? After years of suffering and waiting, it seemed like yet another disappointment. But what Joseph didn't know was that God was preparing something greater. 2 years later, Pharaoh had troubling dreams that no one could interpret. It was then that the cupbearer finally remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh about his ability to interpret dreams. Joseph was brought before Pharaoh, and with God's wisdom, he revealed the meaning of the dreams. 7 years of plenty would be followed by 7 years of famine. Not only did Joseph interpret the dream, but he also gave Pharaoh a plan to prepare for the famine. Pharaoh was so impressed that he immediately appointed Joseph as second in command over all of Egypt. In one moment, Joseph went from a prisoner to a ruler. The very dreams he had as a teenager came true. His brothers eventually came to Egypt seeking food during the famine, and they bowed before him, just as God had shown him years before. Looking back, Joseph could finally see that every hardship, every betrayal, every delay was part of God's perfect plan. If he had never been sold into slavery, he wouldn't have ended up in Egypt. If he hadn't been falsely accused and imprisoned, he wouldn't have met Pharaoh's officials. If the cupbearer had remembered him earlier, he might have been released from prison too soon and missed his divine appointment with Pharaoh. When Joseph finally reunited with his brothers, they were afraid that he would seek revenge. But instead, Joseph said something powerful. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Genesis 50:20. This is the key lesson from Joseph's story. What others meant for evil, God used for good. Joseph's journey teaches us that God's plans often take time to unfold. Just because something hasn't happened yet doesn't mean God has forgotten. We must remain faithful, even in difficult seasons. Joseph continued to trust God whether he was in a pit, a slave, or a prisoner. Delays are not denials. Just like Joseph had to wait years before his breakthrough, sometimes our answers come later than we expect, but they come at the right time. God can turn what was meant for harm into something good. No matter what trials we face, God can use them to bring about His greater purpose. Life often brings unexpected challenges, hardships, and setbacks. There are times when we face pain, betrayal, and disappointment, and we wonder, how can anything good come from this? When things don't go as planned, it's easy to feel discouraged and believe that our struggles have no purpose. However, the Bible reminds us that God is always at work, even in the midst of our trial. In Romans 8:28, we are given a powerful promise. This verse doesn't say that only good things will happen to us. Instead, it reassures us that even the bad, painful, and confusing moments will ultimately be used for our good. God is the master weaver, taking every thread of our lives, both the bright and dark strands, and weaving them into something beautiful. Even when we don't understand why something is happening, we can trust that He is working behind the scenes. Sometimes when we go through suffering, we ask, why is God allowing this? We may think that our pain is meaningless, but in reality, God never wastes a trial. The struggles we face often serve a greater purpose, whether it's shaping our character, strengthening our faith, or positioning us for something greater. Take the story of Job. He was a faithful servant of God, yet he lost everything: his family, his wealth, and his health. His suffering was unimaginable, and even his friends questioned him, assuming that he must have done something wrong to deserve such pain. Yet, through all of his trials, Job remained faithful, and in the end, God restored everything to him, even more than he had before. Job's suffering was not wasted. It became a testimony of God's faithfulness and power. When we endure difficulties, God is often refining us, strengthening our endurance, and drawing us closer to Him. James 1:2.4 says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." This means that our hardships are not pointless. They are part of God's refining process to mold us into the people He created us to be. The enemy often tries to bring destruction, but God has a way of turning what was meant for harm into something good. Genesis 50:20 illustrates this truth through the story of Joseph. After being betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned, Joseph eventually became a ruler in Egypt and saved many lives during a famine. When he confronted his brothers, he told them, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." This is a powerful reminder that even when others try to hurt us, God can take their evil actions and turn them into something good. Have you ever faced a situation where you felt betrayed, abandoned, or deeply hurt by someone? It's natural to feel angry and wonder why God allowed it. But if you trust Him, He can take even the worst circumstances and transform them into a blessing. Sometimes, the very thing that seemed like a setback turns out to be the stepping stone to something greater. There are times when we pray for something and it doesn't happen the way we expected. We may feel disappointed, wondering why God didn't answer our prayers in the way we wanted. But sometimes what we see as a disappointment is actually God's protection. Think about how many times you wanted something so badly, only to realize later that it wouldn't have been good for you. Perhaps you prayed for a relationship to work out, but it ended. Later, you saw that God was protecting you from something that wasn't His best for you. Maybe you applied for a job you really wanted but didn't get it, only to find out that God had something even better in store. Imagine trying to put together a puzzle without seeing the full picture on the box. Each piece by itself may seem insignificant or confusing, but when all the pieces come together, they form something beautiful. That's how life is. Sometimes we go through seasons that don't seem to make sense, but later we look back and see how every experience, both the good and the bad, was part of a greater picture. Consider the story of Esther. She was an orphan, taken to the king's palace and eventually became queen. At the time, she didn't know why God had placed her there. But when her people were in danger of being destroyed, she realized that God had positioned her for a purpose. Mordecai told her in Esther 4:14, "Sometimes we think that God only works through our strengths, but He also uses our weaknesses and failures. Even when we make mistakes, God can still bring good out of them." Look at Peter. He was one of Jesus' closest disciples, yet he denied Jesus 3 times. He must have felt like a failure, thinking that God was done with him. But Jesus restored him and used him to preach on the day of Pentecost, leading thousands of people to salvation. Acts 2:41. Peter's failure wasn't the end of his story. It became part of his testimony. This shows us that even when we mess up, God can redeem our mistakes and use them for good. His grace is greater than our failures, and He can turn even our worst moments into something beautiful. Right now, you may be in a season where you don't understand why certain things are happening. You may feel like your prayers are unanswered, your dreams are delayed, or your struggles are pointless. But remember this: God is working all things together for your good. Even when you can't see it, He is working. Even when it feels like nothing is changing, He is working. Even when life feels unfair, He is working. What the enemy meant for evil, God will turn for good. What looks like a setback is often a setup for something greater. If you keep trusting Him, you will one day look back and see how everything was part of a bigger plan. God is faithful and He will never fail you. Faith is one of the most powerful forces in the life of a believer. But true faith often requires us to let go of control and trust God completely. This is one of the hardest things for us to do, because as humans, we naturally want to have control over our lives. We want to know what's going to happen, when it will happen, and how it will all work out. But faith calls us to surrender, to step out in obedience even when we don't have all the answers, and to trust that God's plan is greater than our own. One of the biggest barriers to fully trusting God is fear. We fear the unknown, we fear failure, and we fear that things won't work out the way we hope. But the Bible tells us in 2 Timothy 1:7, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." Fear is not from God. It is a tool of the enemy to keep us from fully surrendering to God's will. When we allow fear to take over, we begin to doubt God's promises and question whether He is really in control. But faith is about choosing to trust God even when fear is screaming in our ears. It's about saying, "God, I don't understand what's happening, but I trust You anyway." Look at Peter's experience of walking on water in Matthew 14:22-33. When Jesus called Peter to step out of the boat and walk on water, Peter started off with strong faith. He took bold steps towards Jesus, walking on the waves. But the moment he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the wind and the storm, fear crept in and he began to sink. This is exactly what happens when we allow doubt to overshadow our faith. We start sinking in our worries instead of walking in God's promises. Yet, even as Peter was sinking, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and saved him. This is a beautiful reminder that even when our faith wavers, God never lets us go. He is always there, ready to lift us up and bring us back into His plan. Letting go and trusting God means surrendering our own plans, desires, and timelines and allowing Him to direct our steps. Proverbs 3:5-6 gives us this instruction. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him and He will make your paths straight. Notice that this verse doesn't say trust in the Lord with part of your heart. He says with all your heart. This means that we are called to trust God completely, not just when it's convenient or when things are going our way. It also tells us not to lean on our own understanding because our understanding is limited, but God sees the full picture. A powerful example of surrender is Abraham. God called Abraham to leave his homeland and go to a place He would show him without giving him all the details. Genesis 12:1. Abraham had to leave behind everything familiar and step into the unknown, trusting that God's plan was better than his own. Later, when God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, Abraham once again had to demonstrate unshakable trust. Even though the request seemed impossible, Abraham obeyed, and in the last moment, God provided a ram as a substitute. Genesis 22:13. This story teaches us that when we trust God enough to surrender what we hold most dear, He will always provide exactly what we need. Many people think that trusting God means simply waiting for Him to move. While there are seasons of waiting, faith is not passive, it is active obedience. James 2:26 tells us, faith without works is dead. When God calls us to step out in faith, we must take action, even when we don't see the full picture. Noah is a great example of this. God told him to build an ark because a great flood was coming, even though Noah had never seen rain before. It must have seemed completely illogical. Yet Noah obeyed. He spent years building the ark while others mocked him. But because he acted in faith, he and his family were saved. God often calls us to take steps of faith before we see the outcome. We must move forward in obedience even when we don't understand. One of the hardest things for us to do is release control and trust God's plan. We often try to manipulate situations to work in our favor or take matters into our own hands when things don't happen quickly enough. But trying to control everything only leads to frustration, anxiety, and disappointment. Sarah, Abraham's wife, struggled with this. God had promised Abraham that he would have many descendants, but when years passed and she remained childless, Sarah took matters into her own hands. She told Abraham to have a child with her servant Hagar, Genesis 16. But this decision led to conflict, pain, and complications. If Sarah had waited on God's timing, she would have avoided unnecessary struggles. When we try to force things to happen instead of waiting on God, we often end up creating more problems for ourselves. God doesn't need our help. He needs our trust. Faith doesn't mean that everything will always go smoothly. There will be times when life takes unexpected turns, when prayers seem unanswered, and when we don't understand what God is doing. But true faith is trusting Him even in those moments. Think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel 3. When King Nebuchadnezzar threatened to throw them into the fiery furnace for refusing to worship his golden statue, they boldly declared, "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and He will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if He does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Daniel 3:17-18. This is faith at its highest level, trusting that God is able to save, but choosing to remain faithful even if He doesn't answer in the way we expect. In the end, God delivered them from the fire, but their faith was not dependent on the outcome. It was rooted in their trust in God's sovereignty. In a world where everything moves fast, we often want immediate results. We live in a society of instant gratification, where we expect things to happen according to our schedules. But God operates on a different timetable, one that is perfect, intentional, and far beyond our understanding. Many times, we pray for something and expect God to answer right away. When He doesn't, we start to doubt. We wonder if He has forgotten about us or if He's even listening at all. But God's delays are not His denials. Just because something isn't happening right now doesn't mean God isn't working. His timing is always right, even when we don't understand it. Waiting is one of the hardest things to do. It can feel frustrating and discouraging, especially when we see others around us moving forward while we feel stuck. It's easy to think, God, why haven't you answered my prayer yet? Or why are you making me wait? But what we often fail to realize is that God is preparing us in the waiting. There is a reason for every delay. Sometimes God is developing our character, strengthening our faith, or protecting us from something we can't see. Isaiah 40:31 reminds us of the power of waiting on God. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Waiting isn't wasted time. It's a time of renewal, growth, and preparation. If we rush ahead of God, we might step into something we're not ready for. But if we trust His timing, we'll receive what He has for us at the right moment. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, Genesis 17:4. Yet he and Sarah waited decades for a child. As the years passed, they grew impatient. Sarah took matters into her own hands and gave her servant Hagar to Abraham to have a child. But this decision led to complications and strife. Genesis 16, finally, at the age of 100, Abraham saw God's promise fulfilled when Isaac was born. Genesis 21:1-3. This teaches us an important lesson. When we try to force things in our own timing, we can create unnecessary struggles. But when we trust God's timing, we receive His best. Joseph had a dream that he would one day be a great leader, Genesis 37:5. But instead of seeing that dream come true right away, he was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. For years, it seemed like Joseph's life was going in the opposite direction of his dream. But God was working behind the scenes. At the right time, Joseph was promoted to second in command in Egypt, and he was able to save his family and many others during a famine, Genesis 41:46. If Joseph had given up on God's timing, he never would have seen the fulfillment of his dream. His story reminds us that delays are not the end of the story. God is preparing something greater. This means that when God finally moves, it will be worth the wait. The blessing that comes in His timing will be far greater than anything we could have made happen on our own. Think about how a baby grows in the womb. A mother may be eager to meet her child, but if the baby is born too soon, it may not survive. There is an appointed time for birth, and when that time comes, the baby is fully developed and ready for life. The same principle applies to God's timing in our lives. If we rush things, we may end up with something that isn't fully developed or ready. But when we wait on God's appointed time, we receive the fullness of His blessing. One of the most comforting truths in life is that God has a plan for each of us, one that is far greater than anything we could ever imagine. We may have our own dreams, desires, and goals, but ultimately God's plan is the best plan. His wisdom surpasses our understanding, and His ways are higher than ours. Even when life doesn't make sense or things don't go the way we expected, we can trust that God is in control and that He is leading us towards something greater than we could ever plan for ourselves. As human beings, our vision is limited. We can only see what's right in front of us, and we make decisions based on our current knowledge and emotion. But God sees the full picture, past, present, and future. He knows what's best for us, even when we don't understand why things are happening the way they are. Have you ever made plans only to watch them fall apart? Maybe you had a vision for your career, your relationships, or your future, but something happened that changed everything. In those moments, it's easy to feel frustrated, lost, or even abandoned. But what What if the things we see as setbacks are actually setups for something better? Joseph had dreams of greatness as a young man, but instead of stepping into that destiny immediately, he was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused and thrown into prison. Genesis 37:39. If Joseph had looked at his circumstances alone, he might have thought his dreams were destroyed, but God was working behind the scenes. Every hardship Joseph faced was preparing him for a greater purpose. In time, he was elevated to second in command over all of Egypt and was able to save his family and an entire nation during a famine. Genesis 41 verse 39, verse 40. What seemed like a series of setbacks was actually a divine setup for something much greater. Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace, but after killing an Egyptian, he fled to the wilderness and spent 40 years as a shepherd, Exodus 2. He probably thought his life was over, that his chance at leadership was gone. But God had a greater plan. In His perfect timing, God called Moses to lead the Israelites out of slavery and into freedom. If Moses had followed his own plan, he might have lived a quiet, unremarkable life in the desert. But because he followed God's plan, he became one of the greatest leaders in history, used by God to perform miracles and deliver an entire nation. Paul, formerly Saul, had a plan for his life. He was a well-educated Pharisee who zealously persecuted Christians, believing he was doing the right thing. But God had a different plan. On the road to Damascus, Jesus appeared to him, changing his life forever. Acts 9:1-6. Instead of being a persecutor, Paul became one of the greatest apostles, writing much of the New Testament and spreading the gospel to the nations. Paul's story shows that God's plan is always greater than our past mistakes, and He can use anyone for His purpose. The key to experiencing God's greater plan is surrender. When we insist on our own way, we may find ourselves frustrated and disappointed. But when we let go and allow God to take control, we step into something far better than we could have imagined. One of the biggest reasons people struggle with trusting God's plan is because it often doesn't look like what we expected. We may have envisioned life going a certain way, getting married by a certain age, having a successful career, achieving certain goals. But then things turn out differently. In those moments, it's easy to feel discouraged or even question God. But God's plan is often different because He is leading us to something better. What we think we need may not be what's truly best for us. As we reflect on God's greater plan, let us remember that He is always in control. Even when we don't understand His ways, life will have its ups and downs, unexpected turns and moments of uncertainty. But through it all, God remains faithful. Instead of worrying about the future or trying to force our own plans, we should choose to rest in God's promises. When we surrender our desires, dreams, and uncertainties to Him, we allow Him to work in ways that go beyond what we could ever imagine. Jeremiah 29:11 reminds us of this beautiful truth. God's plan is always for our good. Even when life doesn't make sense, we can have confidence that He is leading us, shaping us, and preparing us for something greater. So instead of holding on tightly to our own way, let's make the choice today to leave it in God's hands and trust His perfect plan. May we walk forward in faith, knowing that the God who created the universe is also writing our story and He will never fail us.